With the talk. So hi everyone, I'm Dr. Giovanna Pineda, and today I'm presenting Dr. Hilary Jones. She is our distinguished lecturer. This is our 9th annual Theta induction ceremony where we have a distinguished speaker come. So Dr. Hilary Jones, she's Associate Professor of History at Florida International University. She's also Graduate Program Director of African and African Diaspora Studies. And she's the author of The Métis of Senegal, Urban Life and Politics in French West Africa, which was published recently in 2013. Today, she will present on her latest research from Senegambia to the French Antilles, West Africa, and the making of the French Atlantic world. Okay, if you're just...
Thank you all so much, and let me just say thank you to Phi Alpha Theta, to the students who organized and invited me to come and present to you today. I don't always get a captive audience to talk about my favorite subject, so thank you for that, to the students who have just been inducted, and for also reminding us as faculty why we do what we do. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and to Dr. Pineda for helping to organize, Dr. Walker and Dr. Snyder, friendly faces who I've known along the way. Thank you for being here as well. So I prepared a talk today. Just realized it looks like it may be a bit.
Is it stretched?
No, you know what it is? It's, you know what, I think maybe, is that the only, was that the only PowerPoint that we saw for the,
Let me see.
okay, let me just check. I'm like, oh, there was one that was a little more.
Okay, so I got that one.
You know what? Let's go to Scout. Let's go to talks. It's in talks.
Yeah.
I was like, I know there's one.
Oh, this
That one.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. More pretty pictures.
Okay. And I'll make it big.
Okay. Excellent. So the title of my talk is From Senegambia to the French Antilles, West Africa and the Making of the French Atlantic. And it comes from a new book project that I'm working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the nature of this project, why the study of French West Africa matters, why it matters to the study of Atlantic world histories, and also why I think it gets at some of these issues that are very much in the zeitgeist right now, that is how we deal with memories and legacies of the slave trade in our contemporary times. And I'm doing that primarily through the lens of, there we go. Through the lens of a place that I spent a lot of time living and studying on the west coast of Africa, the Atlantic coast towns of Saint Louis, Senegal, and Gorée, Senegal, or the country of Senegal more broadly. I wanted to start out today, though, with an image of the sculptor Mel Edwards. He's African American, and he had spent a good deal of his career going back and forth between the United States and West Africa, and lived in Senegal. And he dedicated this column of memory to the city of Saint Louis in the north part of Senegal as a remembrance of the slave trade. Many people might be familiar with this area because Gorée Island is one of the UNESCO World Heritage sites. And so there's a good deal of tourism that comes through Gorée, but not so much through Saint Louis. It's a little tiny island at the mouth of the Senegal River where the Senegal opens out into the Atlantic Ocean. And so if you didn't know much about it, you wouldn't even understand today that there was a slave trade that was important in this area in this time period. So this is from Mel Edwards. In my previous research, the work that I did was on French colonialism in Senegal from the perspective of the Euro-African, or Métis, they would say in French, mixed race population. Primarily in 19th century Senegal, but I dealt with the long 19th century, from the late 1800s, the period, well, really 1750, excuse me, all the way up until the early 1800s. The Métis constituted a kind of in-between socioeconomic class of people. They were born in Senegal, of African mothers and European fathers. They were the products of a kind of hybrid African-French society that emerged in these island towns, Saint Louis and Gorée, during a time in which these locations served as key ports of trade, slave trade, but also trade in all sorts of goods that passed through these areas in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. So in my book, The Métis of Senegal, I examined how this group of people articulated ideas about race, colonialism, and class, and the ways in which they used their close proximity to French officials, French colonial officials, to influence and challenge French policy in the era of so-called legitimate trade, the 19th century era of legitimate trade, once the slave trade ends, and trade interests in Europe change from an interest primarily in slavery to that of legitimate, what they called then, so these are my air quotes, legitimate trade goods. And this was also a time in which Europeans began to embark on imperial expansion, moving in from the coast into the interior regions of the continent. So in that project, I concentrate on understanding where and how Senegambia's Atlantic coast towns fit into the development of the Atlantic slave trade. But it always sort of seemed to be to me that the slave trade was kind of a subtext to the larger story. It wasn't the central focus of my analysis. So in this project, I focused much more squarely on the nature of the Atlantic slave trade. So my what is the premise of my talk today? Or what do I seek to do in my talk today? What I suggest to you is that Senegal's tiny Atlantic towns and inlets matter to the making of geographic, political, and social space that we may refer to as the French Atlantic. Doing so allows for a deeper understanding of the trajectories and life stories of individuals who may otherwise be lost to history. This is a map of the Atlantic world around 1700 designed by historian Ira Berlin. Ira Berlin defined the Atlantic world as the landmasses, waterways, and islands that are created by the area bounded by the Atlantic littoral. The Atlantic world emerged as a result of the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. In textbooks, we are commonly taught to see it as a triangle trade or a process of exchange that moved in one definite pattern, from Europe to Africa to the Americas and back to Europe. But in reality, the nature of these exchanges changed over time. They often involved multiple trade links on the African continent, so traders sailing from parts of West Africa on the Senegambia coast, say, to Sierra Leone to trade goods that they would then bring to the Bight of Benin in exchange for slaves. The slave trade also involved the remaking of cargo ships into slavers on the west coast of Africa before transporting the enslaved to the New World. In the 19th century, the trade switched. It moved further east along the coast of Africa and often involved direct sailing voyages between West Africa and the Caribbean or North and South America, right? So sort of complicating this idea of a triangle trade that we're all familiar with. For France, the Atlantic world consisted of the old regime plantation colonies of the Caribbean, settler colonies in North America. So here we're talking about Louisiana under French rule. We're talking about what they called New France, or what we today refer to as Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada. And then a few comptoirs, or trading outposts along the Senegal and Gambia rivers. And literally in French, the word comptoir translates into bank branch. So they didn't even think of these as colonies in the sense of a formal colony, at least not in the 1700s and the early 1800s. And then the French Atlantic ports, which served as launching places for the trade. So here, La Rochelle, Brest, Nantes, Bordeaux, Havre, something like 85% of the ships that left Nantes ended up trading in Saint-Domingue, right? So something like 85% of the ships that were outfitted in Nantes ended up in what we call today Haiti or Saint-Domingue. So I define the French Atlantic as the group of exchanges, patterns of migration, and administrative systems that developed in the Atlantic in response to the expansion of French interests in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Senegal's small island towns and inlets are considered remote locations. Senegambia's small island towns and inlets are considered remote locations. So I'm talking about, if you can get the pointer, there we go. Maybe it's not.
It doesn't show very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can see here on the west coast of Africa near the Cape Verde Islands, the westernmost point on the African continent, which in Senegal they refer to as Africa's nose. Right? That today we think of these places as kind of remote, peripheral. They were not the center of colonial empires, but these kinds of little island towns and locations that, even though we might consider them to be unimportant, were critical to world historical developments. Right? They were critical to the emerging global economy and international political relations of this area in the 18th and 19th century. Interestingly, today, these locations are also among the most endangered when it comes to sea level rise. And their communities will probably be among the bellwethers for adapting to changes caused by environmental uncertainty. And here I'm reminded of the scholar Etta Fields, who makes the point in studying rice growers in this region of Senegambia and West Africa, that they've also been dealing with climate change for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, because the Sahara Desert was, of course, not the desert before it became this very dry landmass that we know it as today. Okay, so what do these pre-colonial African ports have to do with our understanding of the making of the modern world? I argue that closely examining the role of Senegambia in the making of the French Atlantic shows how imperial networks created linkages between Africa and the Caribbean in unintentional ways. Secondly, understanding migration, forced and voluntary, of enslaved and free people of color between Senegal and the French Antilles shifts our understanding of the Atlantic world as the product of decisions made only by officials and planters, to shining a light on how slaves and free people of color understood and navigated the Atlantic world. Finally, no slave narratives exist for the French Atlantic and Indian Ocean colonies before 1848, right? So unlike in the sort of English language universe, there are no slave narratives or memoirs that we can point to look at the individual stories of enslaved people in the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean colonies that the French controlled before 1848. So recovering the names and tracing the paths of enslaved Africans and free people of color pierces the silence of the experience of subordinate individuals in this context. Okay. So the next part of my talk is about the deportation of Antilleans to Senegal after the Haitian Revolution, or the deportation of a group of people from Martinique who came to Senegal in the decades after the Haitian Revolution. So I want to sort of use this as a kind of opening anecdote, and then we'll go back and look more specifically at the nature of the French Atlantic in this time period. So on the 12th of September, 1844, the French Naval Ministry requested information regarding the state's authority to expel so-called dangerous slaves from the French Antilles to Senegal. This request was made at a time in which the anti-slavery movement was beginning to make some inroads in French public discourse. Only 4 years later, in 1848, the Second Republic would come to power in France and would immediately declare an end to slavery on French soil. That's how they described it, right? An end to slavery on French soil. So the report, commissioned by the French Naval Ministry, included correspondence between the military and the governor of Senegal regarding slaves who had been transported from Senegal to Martinique between 1826 and the early 1830s. In February of 1826, the Private Council of Martinique and Guadeloupe issued a royal order stating that, quote, various slaves recognized as dangerous to the public peace in these two colonies must be sent to Senegal and placed at the disposition of the local authority. 2 years later, in early 1828, a petite golette, this is a sailing craft that's similar to a small schooner for sailing aficionados. In 1828, this petite golette arrived to Gorée Island in Senegal from Fort Royal in Martinique, carrying 7 slaves expelled by the Private Council of Martinique. According to the governor of Senegal, this group arrived despite almost no communication between Martinique and Senegal and with little information about the enslaved except for notes on their age, profession, and, quote, utility as taken upon their disembarkation at Gorée. Skeptical of this policy, the governor cautioned that without prior knowledge of the customs or language, the, quote, le nègre des Antilles, here deposed on the land of their fathers, are certain to meet death here or slavery even worse than in America. And America was the sort of general term for the Caribbean. The policy, he added, quote, must be extremely rigorously applied and only to slaves whose conduct has been shown as dangerous here as in other colonies. This document sheds light on French attitudes towards slavery and French anxieties about the enslaved in the wake of the French Revolution. It offers a perspective on the policy of exile as a means of dealing with resistance of captives and the insecurity of white planters living amongst a majority Black slave population in the plantation colonies of the Caribbean. At the same time, interrogating the short-lived period of expulsion of so-called dangerous individuals from the Caribbean shows how the Senegal colony became a central location for the circulation of people, ideas, and goods in the 19th century French Atlantic, a kind of reverse migration or reverse diaspora, if you will, right? It's important to think about the fact that, and the governor of Senegal recognized this at the time, that these individuals were not from Senegal originally. They were likely born in Martinique, in the Caribbean, with little or no contact to Senegambia prior to returning there in these voyages of exile. Extant documentation collected by the Senegal administration, moreover, helps us to reconnect the life stories of men and women who otherwise existed as footnotes to the history of the Haitian Revolution and its reverberations throughout the greater Caribbean and even to the Atlantic coast regions of West Africa. And in discussion, I can talk a little bit about this deportation policy if you're interested. Senegal was not the only place in which the French deported slaves, but it was one in which they could use the sort of argument that they must have some connection to this place because of sort of racial thinking on the part of French officials during this time period. Okay. So, understanding the French Atlantic world, I want to talk a little bit here about how we can understand or situate the nature of this group of people within the wider dynamics of the French Atlantic. And this may be a little bit difficult to see, but the essential, I'm going to go over some of the statistical information, so you'll get it here. This slide comes from the database Voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which some of you may be familiar with and is extremely useful for doing research on the quantitative side of the slave trade. So historians' interest in the transatlantic slave trade has generated a wealth of studies on the political and economic structures of the trade, the nature of the Middle Passage, data on the number of voyages and their trajectories from Europe to Africa, the Americas, and then Europe again. Yet a good deal of our understanding of the slave trade comes from literature on England and Anglophone colonies, and more recently Portugal and Spain. The relative production of English language studies, especially those accessible to us in the US, has to do with the fact that England accounted for a greater share of the overall percentage of the trade. According to the Voyages database, 34.2% of all slave trade voyages originated in England, compared to 14.5% that originated in France. British ships carried 3,259,441 slaves from Africa to the New World, as opposed to 1,381,404 that were trafficked on French ships. The trade from Portugal outnumbered Britain, having transported 5,848,266 enslaved people in the history of the slave trade from 1501 to about 1850. And the data indicates that of the 1 million or so slaves trafficked on French ships, only 124,246 originated in Senegal. Right? So the overall picture here is that the slave trade in its entirety, figures, I think, tell it, today our data, the consensus is that something like about 13 million individuals constituted the entire trade, including those who died in the Middle Passage. Right? The French trade was a small portion of that, not as small as places like Denmark, for example, right? A small portion of that. And the Senegambian trade was fairly small. Most of the slave trade came from West Central Africa, or the Bight of Benin and Bight of Biafra. But as an administrative site, Senegambia was extremely important. So despite these numbers, there is also there is a reluctance to address the slave trade in historical study as a factor in the making of modern France. So in the French literature, there's also this kind of silence around the slave trade. And this has to do with a few factors. First, the French trade was at its height in the 18th century when Saint-Domingue served as the most profitable of the French plantation colonies in the Americas. The Haitian Revolution brought an end to that lucrative trade. As a result, the slave trade faded from French consciousness, and then because of the political struggle of 19th century France was to realize the ideal of the French Republic, the narrative about the slave trade emphasized abolition over the trade itself. Right? So the French so-called participation is a kind of thorny issue in discourse about the relationship of slavery to the French nation. Studies of the French Atlantic, moreover, tend to pay more attention to relations between French settlers and indigenous people in the old regime colonies, or plantation slavery in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean islands, rather than the trade itself. Finally, discussion of the slave trade is linked to the ambivalent relationship between France, anti-colonialism, and French overseas territories in the Caribbean. After the Haitian Revolution, Martinique and Guadeloupe remained as settler colonies under French control. Guyana and South America served as a penal colony for the French. And after 1850, France expanded its interests in West Africa to consolidate control over these vast territories of the interior. So that in 1904, France formed the Federation of French West Africa, headquartered in Dakar, right? So the imperial focus of France in Africa shifted to the interior colonies of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. In 1946, the French National Assembly recognized the Caribbean territories as overseas departments of France, and in 1960, Senegal gained its independence from France, right? So that's the timeline. But before we move on to what these folks experienced in Senegal, I wanted to take just a minute to bring us back to why this matters today, right? And particularly why this subject is of such intense debate in France today. In 2001, this law was passed that made France the first and only nation to recognize slavery as a crime against humanity. And it was authored and passed, or got the support of the first woman, first and only Black woman, who was appointed to serve as the Minister of Justice during the government of Francois Hollande, the Tabouria law, Christiane Tabouria. And so this law has had a great deal of impact because it explicitly calls for the development of an academic curriculum, the promotion of programs that research in history and humanities on the slave trade, slavery, and its legacies. And while the Tabouria law enshrined the notion that France must acknowledge and understand the role of the slave trade, it also racialized categories of people in French policy. right? And this is kind of controversial in a country in which the Republic has always claimed to be colorblind, right? So the idea of even marking someone's racial category on a census form, for example, is something that in France would never be done because the Republic is said to be colorblind in that kind of way. And I can talk a little bit more about that in our question and answer period. So one of the major tensions in France today concerns the racial divisions created by the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean. And it also intersects with the fact that Caribbean territories, at least those in Martinique and Guadeloupe, did not experience the same nature of anti-colonial struggle that occurred in Haiti, West and Equatorial Africa. So there's this way in which the French islands of the Caribbean are linked. They're not only linked to mainland France, they are citizens of France. They are overseas territories of France. And so this is part of that sort of reckoning that France has to do with its history in the Caribbean and in Africa. The Tabaria Law underscores a contradiction in modern French history that tends to celebrate abolition and abolitionists in a narrative of French achievement of Republican ideals, but downplays the ways in which France participated and profited from the slave trade, and specifically how Black people who experienced the trade shaped French politics, society, and culture. Historian of the Caribbean Laurent Dubois recently made the argument in an article for the online journal Aeon that to overcome the problem of racial exclusion in the West, the political history of the 21st century, he said, must include Napoleon and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, right? So that we have to recognize the role that people of color have played in the making of these modern Western democratic Republican societies. Du Bois suggests that the concepts of freedom, democracy, and citizenship espoused by the West emerged as much as in the Caribbean as in Europe. And I would maintain that Africa and African locations were also foundational in shaping the struggle for freedom and human rights, and that should inform our understanding of the past and also our politics today. So let's go to West Africa and think a little bit about what was happening in West Africa in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Historian Boubacar Bari defines Greater Senegambia as the lands bounded by the Senegal and Gambia rivers and that extends to the southern rivers that border Sierra Leone. The region faces the Atlantic Ocean to the east, the Sahara Desert on its northern border. It encompasses savanna grasslands and equatorial rainforest to the south. It refers to the modern-day notions of Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, French Guinea, we call it Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, or Portuguese Guinea, as well as parts of Mauritania and Mali. The quantitative side of slavery studies has sought to determine an approximate volume of slave exports from Greater Senegambia to the Americas. A precise accounting is difficult to determine, however, because of the uneven nature of sources and inadequate data. Senegambia played a significant role in African exports to the Americas in the first 2 centuries of the slave trade, when Portugal held a monopoly over the slave trade from this region. By the late 16th century, the French and English entered into the trade by establishing forts on the Senegal and Gambia rivers. These forts facilitated the work of French mercantile companies, which acquired captives from the upper Senegal and upper Gambia River, and then transported them to trade locations on the Atlantic coast. Exports from Senegambia increased in the late 17th and early 18th century, with the heaviest volume between 1720 and 1740, right? During that time period in which Saint-Domingue was kind of the crown jewel colony for the French, the plantation colony for the French in the Caribbean. In the 18th century, 337,000 enslaved Africans left the ports of Senegambia in the Atlantic trade. French slaving voyages supplied the vast majority of slaves for plantation labor to Caribbean islands, especially to Saint-Domingue, with a larger number of these voyages originating in Nantes, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux. In the 19th century, the slave trade shifted markedly to the east after Britain, France, and other nations prohibited the slave trade. The majority of slave voyages departed from Ouida in the Bight of Benin, as you can see on this map, followed by ports in West Central Africa. Despite these changes, in the 19th century, Senegambia still accounted for approximately 200,000 Africans sold into slavery for labor in the Americas during the illegal phase of the slave trade. In terms of ethnic origin, the majority of Africans trafficked in the late 18th and 19th century came from the Bight of Biafra and West Central Africa, rather than Senegambia. The one exception is North America, where Gwendolyn Midlow Hall says that the concentration of Senegambians has been underestimated for the years between 1751 and 1775, and again between 1801 and 1820. And we certainly find evidence of concentrations of Senegambians along the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Alabama, and in Spanish Florida. Okay. So on the Senegambian side, for the French, before 1860, the Senegal colony, right, they called it the colony of Senegal and dependencies, consisted only of the island outposts of Saint Louis and Gorée, which you can see here at the mouth of the Senegal River, and on the nose of Senegal, on the Cape Verde Peninsula, the little island of Gorée, just to the south of the Cape Verde Peninsula. The Senegal colony consisted only of the island outposts of Saint Louis and Gorée, St. Joseph on the Falame River on the Gambia, shipped ashore trade on the Petite Côte, or the little coast, extending from the Saloum to the Gambia River. Saint Louis served as the headquarters for the French military and the governor who administered the territory. The town also acted as the most important commercial port for Atlantic commerce in the 19th century. After the Napoleonic Wars, France regained control over its Senegal possessions from Britain. As a signatory to the Treaty of Vienna in 1814, France agreed to end the slave trade within 5 years. On the 29th of March, 1815, Napoleon declared suppression of the slave trade. And then the Restoration monarchy under Louis XVII published a law that held that any ship that sought to introduce the slave trade would be confiscated, cargo would be confiscated, and, quote, blacks employed in the colonies for public works. Okay, so that was in 1815. France creates the colony of Libreville in Gabon, in Central Africa, just in sort of West Central Africa, in the 1830s. Right, so this was not an immediate. There was not an immediate effect of this particular decree. With the end of the slave trade, the Restoration monarchy sent French settlers to Senegal with schemes to create colonies, create plantations for cotton production. The plantation scheme failed, and instead the most lucrative trade from the region centered on legitimate trade in gum arabica, a natural byproduct of the acacia trees on the Senegal River, that was supplied by Trarza and Bracana Moors, who were caravan traders on the north bank of the Senegal. Gum is that resin that comes out of these trees and could be used to stiffen fabrics, in bookbinding, in pharmaceutical production, as an edible additive. So it had many different uses and was in high demand in 19th century Europe. Since the late 18th century, these caravan traders brought supplies of gum to the escales or trade depots on the Senegal, when Senegalese traders exchanged European manufactured goods, namely textiles, for gum exports that they transported to Saint Louis. The Métis population served as middlemen in the Atlantic trade for French merchant firms who maintained warehouses in Saint Louis. The Métis went upriver and did the upriver trade. And that's the historic map of Saint Louis, Senegal, and a map of Saint Louis around 1840, 1850. I don't have one here of Gorée, but it's very similar. And you'll also notice that the French kind of created this very rationalized looking plan to the island, but it took a long time for it to look like that, right? That they were less organized than the French designed them in some of their maps. But both Saint Louis and Gorée are these little tiny islands, several kilometers long, in the ocean, or in this case, at the mouth of the Senegal River. Although less important to France in the 19th century, Gorée played a key role in managing French interests south from the Gambia River to the Sierra Leone frontier. British, French, and US merchants operated trade houses on the island and supervised a network of trade agents who operated south along the Gambia, the Casamance River, and also into the Bisagos Islands. Following the 1818 law making the trade illegal, the governor of Senegal ordered the commandant at Gorée to create a station charged with surveillance of the coast to prevent illegal slavers from embarking and sending ships arrested to Saint Louis, the capital of the colony, where they would then be adjudicated. While France adopted these laws, in practice, officials did not enforce them. The commandant at Gorée refused to condemn 13 sailors from French ships captured by the English for violating the Slave Trade Act. He refused to allow the British to inspect illegal slave ships brought into Gorée, kind of a British-French squabble, or at least they saw it that way, right? It turned out that French officials were also trading slaves clandestinely for merchants by smuggling them on ships to be sold in America. This shows French ambivalence about dealing with illegal slave trading in the region and the waters and patrolling the waters under their control. Okay. So what did Caribbean deportees encounter when they arrived to and were resettled in Senegal? In Gorée and Saint Louis, they would have found a hybrid French-African society with some similarities to the lands that they left, but with other notable differences. Similar to the Caribbean, the island towns relied on a stratification between Frenchmen, people of color, and Black Africans. But unlike in the Caribbean, Senegal was not a settler colony of agricultural plantations. It was a trading community that supported a small and transient European population of male, very few, if almost no, female European women, but male military officials and merchants, right? So we're talking a couple hundred military officials, a few thousand Métis, and then several thousand of the African population. An intermediary class of French-educated Catholic free men and women of color existed in the island towns by the early 19th century. In Senegal, African and Afro-European women known as seigneurs wielded a great deal of power and influence. These women married European men in unions recognized as legitimate according to African custom, but the unions dissolved upon the death or permanent departure of the men from Senegal. Seigneurs became symbols of European and African contact because travelers wrote about their beauty and their wealth. These women owned property, they conducted trade along the Senegal River, they owned slaves, and they rented out company officials. They rented out slaves to company officials. The end of slavery in 1848 contributed to the financial ruin of these women. The Métis or mixed race children produced from these marriages constituted the middleman population that served French merchants and cross-cultural brokers for French officials in their diplomatic relations with African states in the interior. And this sketch that was produced by a French artist shows the women in the conical headdresses in the typical dress of these women known as seigneur, a title taken from the Spanish term señora, or Portuguese term actually, señora, but then sort of Frenchified as the seigneurs moved from Portuguese territories into French-controlled areas. The majority of the population of Saint Louis and Gorée consisted of Africans who migrated to the towns from the interior to work for European mercantile companies or French officials at the fort. Others had a history of seasonal migration to the region to fish or to collect salt, and then they stayed there to provide provisions to Europeans on the coast. By the 1820s, the majority of free Africans adopted Roman Catholicism because of their close proximity to the church. African populations along the Senegal River, however, had long been influenced by Islamization. Increasingly, the African town population also began to adhere to Islam. And this was especially true in Saint Louis. It also becomes true in Gorée, but Saint Louis was in very close proximity to Mauritania and to the movements of Muslim clerics who would come and spread the religion through the Senegal River area. In the 1820s, the south side of Saint Louis was noted as the Christian neighborhood with the construction of the church. And then in the 1830s, construction of a mosque distinguished the north side as the Muslim neighborhood. While Caribbean deportees may have recognized French spoken by officials and elites in the town, the majority of the population spoke Wolof, and even European officials used the language to communicate in informal situations. Religious orders ran the hospital and the schools, but the community recognized female water spirits like Mam Kumba Bang and Mam Kumba Castel. Children would have reveled in the lion masquerade and the annual Christian march called the annual Christmas march called the Finale. The first deportees to arrive in Senegal belonged to the group sentenced to exile for orchestrating the 1822 revolt in Carbet, Martinique. Almost all of the 44 deportees resided in the town of Saint-Pierre or had some connection to Saint-Pierre, even if they resided in other towns like Lamentin or François. Some had left Martinique for Guadeloupe and then returned to Saint-Pierre. The special council condemned these free men of color, to exile, quote, for the maintenance of public order in the colony. On March 8, 1824, the first group of deportees left Fort Royal, Martinique on the corvette Le Tarn. 4 accused of organizing the revolt were transported to the military hospital in Brest and remained in France. Others arrived to Gorée on August 12, 1824. All of them were free men of color categorized as mulâtres. The men ranged in age, mulâtre or mulatta we would say. The men ranged in age from 58 to 25. The Martinique police noted that many of the convicted owned small boutiques or various other properties, even though they were described as, quote, having few means. Others worked as carpenters, tailors, bread makers, masons, leather workers, or farmers. A few owned coffee plantations, and at least one was described as a vagabond and a drunk who would not hesitate to kill. The records of arrest reveal the state of hysteria regarding the threat of black men or men of color posed to the white population and to white women in particular. The special council deported Amboise, a farmer, for, quote, abusing several filles blanches, or white women. The only individuals described as nègre, or black, and slave among the deportees was considered, quote, a monster capable of anything, who cohabitated with a white woman of whom he had several children. The state considered others like Michel Guérin as someone with, quote, plenty of hate for whites, while others were accused of injuring a white man or simply threatening to hurt a white man. The police sentenced Joseph Ballon to exile for, quote, grossly insulting a young demoiselle blanche. In the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, the white planter class targeted men of color, irrespective of their position as free people and property owners, because of an imagined threat that free men of color posed to their masculinity. Upon arrival in Gorée, the situation of deportees changed markedly from their lives in the Caribbean. The mayor of Gorée noted the profession of the men, but recorded all as, quote, having little means of existence. 11 settled on Gorée, and 26 in Saint-Louis. 5 died, and 1 became an employee of Madame Valentin, a notable Métis woman of Gorée. One of the deportees was granted a passport to embark on the merchant ship La Valentin, commanded by Monsieur Simeon, and destined for St. Lucia, Dominica, and St. Thomas. 19 individuals left Gorée for Saint Louis to be employed in the Senegal river trade. One of the surviving documents from this event includes a letter written by one of the deportees who begins by pleading his innocence and arguing that he had been falsely accused and sentenced by the Royal Court of Martinique. Cyril Bisset, he wrote, only distributed the brochure about the situation of free people of color in the French Antilles. And Cyril Bisset was a free man of color who was accused of having spread all kinds of pamphlets and discourse demanding political rights for free people of color in the Caribbean. And so this group of people were sort of caught up in that and were accused of being part of this movement to unseat the planter class in Martinique and in Guadeloupe. Like his comrades, he claimed that he only participated in saving the lives of whites targeted in the event of Carbet. In return, he wrote, they killed my honor and treated me as a conspirator. Despite occupational status and their position as free people with means in the Caribbean, in the Senegal, les Antillais, as they were known, had to remake themselves. For the healthy and the capable, the administration made them, quote, useful by employing them as riverboat crew and workers in the gum trade on the Senegal. The second group of deportees were those who the private council sentenced to exile, either at the request of planters who sought to send, quote, problem slaves out of the colony and, quote, back to Africa. In other cases, the council expelled the enslaved who launched complaints against their masters alleging mistreatment. On September 6, 1826, Mr. Guston of Guadeloupe won his case to the private council for the deportation of 5 of his slaves to Senegal. He suspected the slaves of poisoning other slaves and planning to poison, quote, someone in the family. Mr. Guston's willingness to forego state compensation for the loss of his property convinced the council to forego an investigation, arrest the accused, and deport them on the ship to Senegal. Considering these individuals dangerous, the Naval Ministry gave the governor of Senegal the authority to decide where in Senegal to locate them. On April 10, 1829, a second group of 7 from Martinique arrived on the schooner Le Destin, or Destiny. This group consisted of enslaved men and women, so not free people of color, but enslaved men and women. Of the 4 men, 3 did not know their age, but the official estimated it to be around 60. Weak and suffering from rheumatism, Bertrand was admitted to the hospital in Saint-Louis. The officials sent Michel and Louis, both farmers from Lamentin, to work on the French plantation experiment called Richard Toll. Senegal officials also sent Hélène, a black woman laundress from Fort Royal, to work at Richard Toll. Constance, a gardener from Lamentin, suffered from an ailment and went immediately to the hospital upon arrival. And then in the case of Céline, a 20-year-old mulatresse, officials did not note her placement in the colony, but instead made special mention of her, quote, strong and well-constituted physique that shows her intelligence. The official also noted that she was a mother of 2 young children whom she was forced to leave in Martinique, which she, quote, strongly regretted. On the 15th of April, 1830, another group of 12 deportees of the original group of 18 who boarded the Topaz in Martinique, so 18, but several died en route. These 12 arrived in Senegal. An 1833 report indicated that several of them suffered from age and infirmity and could not work and had come under the complete care of the administration. The final report by officials in Saint-Louis gave an accounting of the status of the remaining deportees in Senegal, following the French declaration that ended slavery in 1848. Convicted of poisoning his master's cattle, Ambroise, a barrel maker, worked at the general store in Saint-Louis, where he earned a meager salary. According to the officials, he, quote, lived in a state of marriage according to the usage of the country, with a negress of Senegal. He converted to Christianity and married in the church 3 years ago. Beatrice, a negress of 72, born in Lamentin on the same plantation as Ambroise, and deported at the same time for the same reason, found work as a laundress in Saint-Louis and became a devoted adherent to the church. Athanasi, age 69, also suspected of poisoning his master's cattle, and a shipmate of Beatrice and Ambroise first worked for the hospital and then took charge of the gardens of the Sisters of Saint-Joseph de Cluny, for whom he brings food, so the report said. In describing the status of Marie-Louise Azaline, or Céline, the officials characterized her in a tragic or overly romanticized register. The official noted that, quote, she calls herself mulatto and has the color and traits of an empress born in Fort Royal. Age 41, she pretends to be originally free. Her case of deportation involved a complaint showing, quote, the hatred of a Creole woman that suspected Céline of, quote, ulterior motives. And Creole in this context means of a French woman born in the colonies. The Creole woman, the official intimates, sought to deport Céline in order to distance Céline from the Creole woman's father, right? The plantation owner's the father, or the father of the father of the plantation. After settling in Senegal, Céline became attached to a soldier on leave, and together they opened a commercial establishment in Saint-Louis. They, quote, married legitimately, and the governor took the opportunity to ask officials in France to speed up the delivery of papers certifying their union. The report concluded with a statement that of these 4, only Ambroise and Beatrice expressed a desire to return to Martinique. In both cases, they sought to see again the children whom they left behind. The governor informed the naval minister that he took the opportunity of the departure of the ship Mathilde for Guadeloupe to return Ambroise and Beatrice to the Caribbean. On the eve of the embarkation, Ambroise declared that he did not want to leave Senegal, whereas Beatrice left alone for Martinique. Okay? So in conclusion, I just want to end here with a few thoughts about why memory, memorialization matters and how we need to link the ways in which we remember and think about the slave trade and the enslaved with what we can know about who they were at the time in which they were living, right? The times in which that they would have experienced. So I've woven this narrative about Senegambia and the French Atlantic through archival documentation, discussion of contemporary debate, and evidence of memorialization of the slave trade in order to illustrate how much more there is to know about the role that Senegambia played in the making of the Atlantic world than previously considered. First, in memorials like that of Mel Edwards' statue in Saint Louis, the dedication of a memorial to the slave trade by the mayor of Pointe-à-Pitre in Guadeloupe to the mayor of Gorée, and this is the Guadeloupe memorial here on the slide. To practices like the Parade of Seigneurs, which you can see here at the Saint Louis Jazz Festival. The finales were something that the Seigneurs began to do in the 1700s and early 1800s, where they would have their slaves, the slaves of their household. So these were not slaves for trade, but slaves of their household, light their way to Mass on Christmas Eve by holding candles. And so it sort of morphed into a kind of commemoration of the early history of European and African interaction in Senegal, which is characterized in places like Saint Louis and Gorée as a kind of period in which African and Europeans mingled and mixed together in very intimate ways, unlike the period of colonial rule and French Empire of the 20th century, right, in which children of mixed racial unions were taken by the French state and put in orphanages. Right? So this period is sort of looked at in that regard. It is clear that the history of the slave trade had a great deal, the history of the slave trade has a great deal of meaning for contemporary France and the ways in which Black people of Francophone Africa and the French-speaking African diaspora have attempted to position themselves in the post-colonial world. I think it worth exploring what memory and memorialization of the slave trade means for these Caribbean and African populations and how it informs the politics of race and Blackness in France. In other words, the linkages between the Caribbean and West Africa. Second, this research attempts to push against the notion that the French slave trade was inconsequential in the making of the Atlantic world, especially as compared to England or Portugal. It reframes the discussion away from thinking about ethnic origins or African survivals to looking at processes that created patterns of movement and migration that shaped the Atlantic world from the perspective of empire, but also through the ways in which officials and planter interests on the ground in these so-called peripheral locations were structuring a universe of contacts, exchanges, and networks that constituted a French Atlantic space and had consequences beyond what they intended. Finally, digging deeper into the documentation about this policy of deportation, and specifically the trajectories of slaves who were accused, imprisoned, deported, and then resettled in Senegal, offers insight into the implications of forced reverse migration. Historian Sue Peabody pointed out that no slave narratives or memoirs of slaves exist for French colonies of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean before 1848. As a result, in the literature on slavery and French Empire, the voices of the enslaved are silenced. So this presentation is an attempt to bring them back into our consciousness. Thank you. I fear that I went over the time that I had intended, but I do want to have time for discussion.
Okay, we do have time for questions, so please feel free to ask.
Yes.
So there's a book by Cecily Fremont about the art of conversion that takes place in, it's centered on the Congo and on Catholicism as it was introduced and kind of syncretically experienced by the Congolese during the period of from the 16th century to the late 18th century. Do you think, because you mentioned stuff like the Fanal and some of the Christian and Muslim interactions with some of the local religious origins, do you think Senegal might be a fruitful area for research of that kind that kind of brings a little more light onto African religious tradition as it was experienced in the early modern?
Okay, that's excellent question. And Cecile Fremont's The Art of Conversion is a masterful work. And for those who don't know, she's an art historian. So she explores Catholicism in the Congo Kingdom in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s through the iconography that the Congolese produced around Christianity and the visual evidence about Christianity in the Congo. The same isn't true for Senegambia, in large part because, with the exception of, so my first thought in answering this, right, is that the presence of Islam was a much more important religious force in this region. I mean, going back to the 12th century, if we think about the Tukulor empires and the early sort of states along the Senegal River Valley that converted to Islam because of the trans-Saharan trade and because of the empires that existed in those regions. But, in the 1700s, early 1800s, there was a series of Islamic revolutions that really Islamicized that region. So the French were also very cautious and aware that they didn't want to proclaim Christianity in areas where Islam had already taken root. They were very careful to say, even to the Christian orders in Saint Louis and in Gorée, you have to stay in Saint Louis and Gorée. You cannot go and proselytize outside of these towns. You can work with the Métis populations. You can work with Black Catholics of the towns, but it can't go beyond that because they were afraid that if it did, it would incite jihad, or it would incite a war against them. So in that regard, we don't have the same sort of history there.
Gotcha.
With the exception of the early Portuguese imprint on the Senegambian coast in the 1400s, in the Jollof kingdoms, south beyond the Gambia River into the Casamance River, if you think about that map there, in the areas going into what the French called the Southern Rivers region, but really we're talking about the region between today's French Guinea and Sierra Leone. The Portuguese did make an impact there, but again, it is less sort of robust in terms of its material evidence. Probably the best work on this is Peter Mark's book on Luso-African architecture and identity of that region. So my answer would probably be no. However, there have been art historians who have looked at the fanals and have looked at the ways in which these parades, which were done at one time, but then sort of fell out of fashion, and then they sort of came back again. One author says it's like a palimpsest. It's the sort of writing and rewriting of new histories on top of this masquerade tradition. So there's some interesting things to think about there, but yeah.
All right, cool, thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Jones, I really enjoyed your presentation. My questions have to do with the larger historiographical issues. How does your work fit in with the narrative of an African agency in the Atlantic slave trade? I'm talking particularly about the book Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World. So how would you characterize the role of Africans in this trade? Well, the other historiographical issue has to do with how the slave trade transformed the political economy of this region, especially when you make the transition from the slave trade to legitimate commerce.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So I'll take the agency question first. And as you know, scholars who study African history are very familiar with the debate about African agency versus African underdevelopment. For example, how we understand the long-term structures or the long-term systematic effects versus the sort of more immediate impacts of the Atlantic slave trade. So the first thing I would say is that in my first work, the population that I was really trying to understand how people of mixed racial ancestry got so embedded in Atlantic commerce and then in French politics. And, I used the argument about African agency to show that these were individuals who were born of the place. They were people who spoke Wolof. They were people who were embedded in the societies. They were people who had African kin networks, who were agents, or who were, let me put it another way, who were part of the links that made Atlantic commerce work out of Senegal. So in a sense, these sort of intermediaries were acting as, well, I don't want to say that they're acting as agents, because that's not where I'm getting at. But they were exercising agency in the sense that they were creating the kind of economic structures that were necessary in order to facilitate the movement of people and goods between Africa and the Americas, Africa, and Europe. But it also puts them in a really sort of tricky position. So this is a little piece of the work, but a larger part of this work has to do with the Métis trade houses that were participating in the illegal slave trade. And I have all sorts of feelings about how to handle this or not to handle this, or how I have to deal with this, because it's a difficult subject to deal with when you're talking with people on the ground in country. That's not to say that everyone was implicated in the illegal slave trade, but that there were individuals who created quite wealthy trade houses. And this was part of the commercial networks of the time. So in that sense, we see African agency operating through these intermediary traders who had relationships with ruling elites in the interior. So to answer the question about the larger historiography, about political economy, and how the slave trade impacts the states and economies of the region, you've noticed that in this talk, I really am talking about people in this little tiny coastal town. And there's a whole universe of things that's happening in the Senegal River Valley, in the Wolof states, in the Soninke states, in the upper Senegal river regions, that are, on the one hand, very much embedded in the networks that are bringing goods and people out of these river regions to the coast, as the Soninke as trading groups of people and populations, states that have interests like the Wallo of Wolof, the Wolof Kingdom of Wallo, that had a particular interest in allegiances with the France so that it could serve as a bulwark for them against Mauritanian invasion. So there are all kinds of ways in which we see political economic decisions being made in the interior, and it's also having an impact in the interior. But this particular project is more concerned with how this trade is operating in the Atlantic. So it's sort of looking at Senegal from that place outward. I have to think a little bit more about this question, because I think there are probably areas that I need to tease out in terms of responding to that historiography. Yes.
So sort of piggyback on that, I hope. I'm particularly interested in the idea of exile and the use of exile as a punishment, but sometimes not necessarily punishment. It's just kind of move these people around, and then how these people are then integrated into these new societies. Like, why are you sending them away? Is this ideal more with self-imposed exile than I think this particular case? But who is being sent for political exile, political agitation in the Caribbean? Who is being sent for other smaller issues? And if these deportees then are becoming a part of the fabric of this society, how are they talking back to the previous colonies? Do they have contacts there, working back in these trade networks? Because they're not really criminals, but they just need to be in a different network. So I'm not sure if I'm asking that exactly right, but yeah, this whole issue of exile and inclusion.
Okay. Yeah, it gives me an opportunity to talk about what that whole policy was about. Yeah, right. And so you bring up a couple of important things to underscore. So yes, there are a couple groups of deportees. And the first one that I talked about, those who were caught up in the Bisset affair and who were part of this kind of scare on the part of Martinique and Guadeloupe planters, that there was this sort of group of free people of color that was going to come for them in the same way that had happened for French planters in Haiti. Those were political exiles, right? They were sent out of the Caribbean because there was a fear that they were fomenting revolt, that they were encouraging other people to organize and to incite violence and to fight. And it's essentially what they were doing was fighting for their rights to vote in a French system, which afforded them as free people the right to vote, right? But because they were in this planter society, it was considered to be a threat. So on the one hand, you have people like that, right? And that first group was, a number of them were first sent to France, and then after France, they were sent to different places. They stayed in France for a while, but then the French officials were like, I don't know if they're really gonna be able to adapt here. And some asked to be able to come back, and they came back to Martinique, for example. But then there's a second group of people in 1828, 1829, 1830, who, some of them, not all, but some were suspected of doing things like poisoning cattle, right? Or threatening their masters, as I read about, right? In one or two ways. But there were others who complained that they were being mistreated. And so the decision of the special counsel was to say, or the private counsel rather, was to say, okay, well, your option is that you can be deported, right? But they were criminalized. They were essentially criminalized and then deported. Senegal wasn't the only place that the French deported. I was going to say people who were not useful anymore, right? This is kind of a big euphemism for the ways in which they understood these people who got caught into the criminal justice system, because they had to be tried of a crime or brought into the court for some particular reason. They sent them to Puerto Rico. They sent them to Virginia very early on. They were sent. They later create Guyana as a kind of penal colony in South America, and they can send people to Guyana. So that second group of people constituted others who also asked for their freedom. I have not been able to find any evidence of these particular individuals writing back, with the exception of the couple of cases that I read in which Ambroise and Beatrice, for example, say to the governor of Senegal, I want to go back. And he communicates that then to the naval ministry, asking permission to send them back. But there's very little of their writing. This file that I came across in the Dakar archives in Senegal contains a manuscript that I think is the writing. It's probably some of these pamphlets like those of Cyril Bisset that were describing the rights of free people of color, but it's a kind of 19th century document, and in many Senegal archives. The conditions are very dry, but it also means that these documents have not been kept in climate-controlled conditions. And because of insects, and they're just not really legible anymore. So it's hard to make out what that might have been. It could have been someone sort of writing against their treatment, but it was too difficult for me to tell. So hope that answered most parts of your question. Yeah. Okay. Oh, you have one more?
I have two minor questions.
Okay.
Now, for graduate students who are interested in doing research on this subject, what kinds of primary documents would you recommend?
Okay. Well, so recently there have been a number of scholars who have done research on the French Atlantic from the perspective of people of color. And much of this research is coming to us through notarized documents. So church records. I did much of this in my first project, but parish records, records of marriages, records of baptism, So there, in the French system, there are the civil registries. Everyone had to go to town hall and register a marriage or register a birth or register a death with the officials at town hall. So these are kept in registries, many of which are searchable through different sites in the French archival system. Some of them may even be online now. So the civil registries are searchable. The other source for this information is in the records of religious orders. The Spiritans, for example, the Holy Ghost fathers, kept records of every one of the marriages, births, deaths of their parish. Most of them have been repatriated back to the headquarters of that archive. So that's one way. The orders of Saint Joseph de Cluny, for example, a female religious order, had operations in Senegal and in West Africa, Asia, Madagascar, the Caribbean. So they have this international archive of kind of religious records. So I'd say the notarized documents. So anyone who's gone for sort of property records, the religious records, the civil registries, Laurel Semley, and her recent work, To Be Free in French, relies on biographies of free people of color in the French Atlantic world from this time period, but then going through the 19th, maybe even early 20th century. She's been able to piece together these kinds of biographies from some of these documents. And then I'm also thinking about Jean Ebrard and Rebecca Scott's Freedom Papers, which is another one that several years ago was published that uses these kinds of notarized documents. And then most recently, Sue Peabody's work, Madeline's Children, which deals with the Indian Ocean colonies, but the same issues of slavery and freedom using legal court cases.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second one is, are there any parallels between the slaves who were resettled in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and the deportees that you talk about?
Wow. Well, so yes, the research on the Sierra Leonean deportees, and to some degree also the recaptives from illegal slave ships that were arrested in North America and then brought in places like Key West and Charleston, and then were resettled in Liberia. This is the subject of a recent study by Charles Lafette on recaptives. So the literature on recaptives and liberated Africans sort of fit with the literature on Sierra Leone. And I think, there in the Sierra Leone case, there's a much bigger population of people. The historiography around their resettlement is much richer and broader, in part because you had missionaries. There were people like Samuel Crowther and others who were either giving testimony to missionaries or writing their own stories that fills up much of the primary source data that we have about these populations in Sierra Leone. The deportees, and I hope I've been pretty clear about this, they're a small population of people and many of them didn't even survive. And so, they kind of become a footnote. And one will read about them in books on the French slave trade, on the Atlantic world, but usually as a footnote. The most extensive evidence I've been able to find comes from this file in the Senegal archives and then the corresponding files in Martinique and in France. So to answer that question, there are commonalities for sure. I think there are more commonalities in the nature of what these urban West African towns were like in the 19th century than the deportees specifically. So the comparisons I would make would be more toward the comparison between Freetown and Saint Louis, Senegal, for example, as opposed to the deportees and liberated Africans. Thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you. Thank you for Dr. Gordon, did you want to announce the next talk? It's also on coming up next month.
Yes, on Tuesday, February 19th, the evening of Tuesday, February 19th, Amelia Bundles, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker is famous because she,
Hair.
Yeah.
Hair, straight
Right.
hair, yeah.
right, cosmetics, beauty parlors,
Mhm.
hair culture, right, as well as economic autonomy, philanthropy.
One of the most important
education.
women, yes, and
Yes.
with her economic wealth, she also did a lot of social justice for
Yes.
African American women. Yes.
So she will be, well, Aaliyah Bundles will be jumping the evening, right, Tuesday, February 19th at the Live Oak Event Center here on campus. From 5:30 to 7:30. So you're all welcome.
Well, thank you,
I'd like to
everybody.
come back.
And congratulations.
For real.
Thank you. I still want to answer your email, but